They locked me in my own bedroom for 2 weeks, the only crime was saying, no more. My hands still tremble when I think about that cold door handle turning again and again, the silence thicker than any chain. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a small studio apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where the sounds of the city used to comfort me. Now they feel like echoes from another life, another person who once believed that love meant giving everything away. The morning light filters through my thin curtains, casting shadows that dance across the worn wooden floor. I can smell the stale coffee from yesterday's cup, still sitting on my kitchen counter next to a stack of unopened bills. Every morning starts the same way now. I wake up, feel for my phone on the nightstand, and check for messages from David, my son, my only child, the person who was supposed to protect me in my golden years. Instead, he became the architect of my prison. For 6 months, he controlled every penny of my Social Security check, my small nursing pension, even the modest dividends from the few stocks I'd managed to save over the years. 6 months of asking permission to buy groceries, to pay for my medications, to live like a human being with dignity. I remember the day it all started. David came to my apartment with tears in his eyes, his face flushed with what I thought was shame. He sat on my old blue sofa, the one I'd bought when he was in high school, and buried his face in his hands. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking like it did when he was 12 and afraid of thunderstorms. "I'm in trouble. Real trouble this time. I should have seen the signs." The expensive watch on his wrist that hadn't been there the month before. The way his eyes darted around my apartment, calculating, measuring. But all I saw was my little boy, scared and desperate. All I heard was the echo of every night I'd tucked him into bed, promising him that everything would be okay. "What kind of trouble, sweetheart?" I asked, moving to sit beside him on the sofa. The cushions sank under our combined weight, and I could smell his cologne, something sharp and expensive that cut through the familiar sense of my home. He looked up at me then, and his eyes were red-rimmed, desperate. "Gambling debts, Mom. Bad ones. They're going to come for me if I don't pay. I need $50,000. $50,000. More money than I'd ever held in my hands at one time. More money than my entire savings account contained." I felt my heart sink into my stomach, that familiar flutter of panic that came whenever David needed something I couldn't give. "David, honey, I don't have that kind of money. You know I don't." My voice was gentle, apologetic, as if I was the one who had failed somehow. His face hardened then, just for a moment, before the mask of desperation slipped back into place. "But you have assets, Mom. You have investments. That money just sits there doing nothing while your son could lose everything." He was right about the investments. Over 40 years of careful saving, of skipping meals to put money away, of working double shifts at the hospital until my feet bled in my sensible shoes. I had managed to accumulate a small fortune, maybe $200,000 spread across various accounts, some blue-chip stocks, even a tiny amount of Bitcoin that a young colleague had convinced me to buy years ago. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to ensure I could live with dignity in my final years. "I can't touch those, David. That's my security. That's what keeps me from becoming a burden on anyone." The words felt foreign in my mouth. When had I ever denied my son anything? He stood up then, pacing across my small living room like a caged animal. "A burden? Mom, do you hear yourself? I'm your son. Your only family. If you won't help me now, when I really need it, then what was the point of all those years of sacrifice?" The guilt hit me like a physical blow. All those years of working night shifts so I could be there for his baseball games. All those Christmas mornings when I'd given him everything I could afford and more. All those times I'd forgiven his mistakes, made excuses for his failures, opened my wallet and my heart because that's what mothers do. "What do you need me to do?" I heard myself asking, even as a small voice in the back of my mind screamed warnings I wasn't ready to hear. His whole demeanor changed. The tears dried up, replaced by a businesslike efficiency that should have terrified me. "Just sign some papers. Give me power of attorney over your finances temporarily. Just until I can get back on my feet and pay you back. It'll be easier this way. I can handle all the transactions, make sure everything gets paid on time. Power of attorney." Those 3 words should have sent me running from the room. Instead, I found myself nodding, thinking about how complicated my finances had become, how confusing all those statements and forms could be. Maybe it would be easier to let David handle things. He was smart, college-educated, successful, or at least he had been before the gambling, before this latest crisis that had brought him to my door with tears and promises. "Just temporarily?" I asked, needing the reassurance even as I felt myself falling into a trap I was too tired and too lonely to recognize. "Just until I get back on my feet, Mom. A few months at most. Then everything goes back to normal, and I'll pay you back every penny with interest." The papers appeared as if by magic. David must have had them prepared in advance, waiting for my consent. I signed them with a shaking hand, not reading the fine print, not asking questions I should have asked. I trusted him because he was my son, because I had spent 7 decades believing that blood meant something, that family was sacred. The first month wasn't so bad. David actually did make my life easier in some ways. He set up automatic payments for my utilities, made sure my rent was paid on time, even had groceries delivered to my apartment. He called me every few days to check in, his voice warm and grateful. "You're saving my life, Mom," he would say. I'll never forget this. But then things started to change. The grocery deliveries became smaller, cheaper brands replacing the foods I was used to. When I asked David about increasing the food budget, he sighed heavily into the phone. "Mom, we need to be more careful with money right now. Things are tight." Tight? With my $200,000 at his disposal? But I swallowed my questions, told myself that David knew what he was doing. He was handling my finances now. Surely he had a plan. The second month brought more restrictions. My cable was downgraded to basic service. My landline, the phone number I'd had for 30 years, was disconnected to save money. When I wanted to buy a new winter coat because my old one was falling apart, David said we'd have to wait until next month. Next month became a phrase I heard constantly. Next month we'd increase the grocery budget. Next month I could get my hair done at the salon instead of cutting it myself in the bathroom mirror. Next month I could afford to take a taxi to my doctor's appointments instead of struggling onto crowded buses with my arthritic knees screaming in protest. By the third month, I started to feel like a stranger in my own life. I would go to the ATM and find my cards were declined. I would call David, and he would explain in patient, condescending tones that he had moved money around for investment purposes, and that I should have called him before trying to make any purchases. "But David, it's my money," I said one day, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Colder. More distant. "Actually, Mom, technically it's under my control now. And I'm trying to protect it. These impulse purchases aren't helping anyone." Impulse purchases. He was talking about a $20 prescription copay that I'd tried to pay for at the pharmacy. It was around this time that I started to notice other things. David's voice in the background when I called, not the desperate, grateful voice of a man who had gotten a second chance, but the confident, slightly arrogant tone of someone placing bets. I could hear the familiar sounds of a television broadcasting sports, the kind of intense focus that only came when money was on the line. One evening, I decided to visit David's apartment, something I rarely did because he always came to me, always had an excuse for why his place wasn't suitable for visitors. I took a taxi, spending the last $20 I had hidden in an old jewelry box, money that David didn't know about because it had been tucked away long before I'd signed those papers. His apartment building was in Midtown, much nicer than I had expected. The doorman barely looked up as I gave David's name, waving me toward the elevators with practiced indifference. I rode up to the 15th floor, my heart pounding with an anxiety I couldn't name. When David opened the door, I saw surprise flash across his face, followed quickly by something that might have been guilt. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of his apartment, expensive furniture, a massive television, artwork on the walls that looked like it cost more than my rent for 6 months. "Mom? What are you doing here? You should have called first." I pushed past him, my nurse's instincts taking over. Something was wrong here, very wrong. The apartment was beautiful, elegant, completely at odds with the story of financial desperation he'd been telling me for months. "David, I don't understand. You said you were in trouble. You said you needed help getting back on your feet." My voice sounded small and confused in the large, luxurious space. He closed the door behind me, and I heard the locks clicking into place. Multiple locks. "Mom, it's complicated. These debts, they're not the kind you pay off all at once. It takes time, strategy. I'm managing your money responsibly while I work through this." I walked further into the apartment, taking in details that made my stomach turn. A bottle of champagne on the counter that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. Designer clothes draped over chairs. A computer screen that showed what looked like an online betting interface. "How much money is left, David?" I asked quietly, though part of me already knew the answer. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was defensive, angry. "There's plenty of money left. But it's invested now, tied up in things that are going to pay off big. You wouldn't understand the complexities of modern portfolio management." Portfolio management. The man who had come to me crying about gambling debts was now talking like a Wall Street executive. I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest, a realization that was too terrible to fully acknowledge. "I want to see the statements, David. I want to know exactly where my money is." His face flushed red. "You don't trust me? After everything I've done to help you, to make your life easier, you're questioning my judgment?" I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm asking to see what's been done with my life savings. That's when he launched into a speech I'll never forget, a masterpiece of manipulation wrapped in the language of love. He told me I was getting old, that I couldn't be trusted to make rational financial decisions. He reminded me of every mistake I'd ever made, the time I'd fallen for a phone scam and lost $50, the credit card bills I'd struggled with after his father left, the way I sometimes forgot to pay bills on time. This is for your own good, Mom. You should be grateful that someone who cares about you is willing to take on this responsibility. Do you know how many elderly people lose everything because they can't manage their finances anymore? I wanted to argue, to tell him that I'd been managing my finances just fine for 73 years. But standing in his expensive apartment, facing the son I'd raised and sacrificed for, I felt suddenly uncertain. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality, my ability to make good decisions. Maybe this confusion and fear I was feeling was just a sign that I really was too old to handle my own affairs. That night, I went home to my small apartment and sat on my old blue sofa, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I pulled out a photo album, one of the few possessions I'd kept from my younger days. There was David at 5, grinning toothlessly at the camera. David at 10, proudly holding up a trophy from Little League. David at 18, standing beside me in his graduation cap and gown. Where had I gone wrong? How had the sweet little boy who used to make me breakfast in bed on Mother's Day turned into someone who could look me in the eye and lie with such practiced ease? The 4th month brought new humiliations. David informed me that he was streamlining my expenses by canceling my health insurance supplement. The basic Medicare coverage is fine, Mom. All these extra policies are just padding the profits of insurance companies. But when I needed to see a specialist about the persistent pain in my joints, I discovered that basic Medicare required copays I couldn't afford, because I no longer had access to my own money. I called David, explaining that I needed $200 for a doctor's appointment. $200? For one appointment? Mom, that's excessive. Maybe you should try some over-the-counter pain medication instead. Over-the-counter pain medication for what turned out to be a serious arthritic condition that would require ongoing treatment. I went to the appointment anyway, charging it to a credit card I'd forgotten I had, one that David hadn't discovered yet. The doctor was kind but concerned, not just about my physical condition but about my obvious stress and anxiety. Mrs. Thompson, you seem very worried about something beyond your joint pain. Is everything all right at home? I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to break down and cry in her office, to admit that my son had taken control of my entire life and I didn't know how to get it back. Instead, I smiled and said everything was fine. After all, David was family. You don't air family business in front of strangers. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the power of attorney papers I'd signed, wondering what exactly they said, what rights I'd given away in my moment of maternal weakness. I found them in a folder David had left with me, and I read them by the light of my bedside lamp. The language was dense, full of legal terminology I didn't fully understand. But the basic message was clear: I had given David complete control over my financial life. Every account, every investment, every penny I'd worked for over 4 decades was now his to manage as he saw fit. And the duration wasn't a few months, as he'd promised, it was indefinite, until he chose to relinquish control or until I was declared mentally incompetent. That's when the real fear set in. Not just fear about my money, but fear about my future. What would happen if I challenged David? What would happen if I demanded my independence back? I was 73 years old, living alone in New York City, with no family except for the son who was systematically dismantling my security. I had a few friends from my nursing days, but we drifted apart over the years. I had neighbors, but we barely knew each other's names. The isolation that I'd been living in for years suddenly felt like a trap that was closing around me. I realized that David had been counting on that isolation, relying on my loneliness and dependence to keep me compliant. As long as I was afraid of being completely alone, I would tolerate being financially abused. But there was something else growing inside me, something that had been dormant for too long. Anger. Pure, clean anger at being treated like a child, like an invalid, like someone whose decades of hard work and careful planning meant nothing. I was a registered nurse who had saved lives, managed complex medical situations, made life-and-death decisions under pressure. I had raised a child as a single mother, put him through college, survived divorce and illness and every other challenge life had thrown at me. And now that same child was telling me I was too incompetent to buy my own groceries? The 5th month was when I started to push back, in small ways at first. I asked to see bank statements. David said they were too complicated for me to understand and would only confuse me. I asked about my stock portfolio. He said the market was volatile and he didn't want me to worry about the day-to-day fluctuations. I asked if any of my money had actually gone toward paying his gambling debts. That question earned me a lecture about trust and family loyalty that lasted 45 minutes. David's voice grew louder and more aggressive as he explained that my suspicions were hurtful and ungrateful. He reminded me of everything he'd done for me, setting up automatic bill payments, handling my finances so I didn't have to worry about them, making sure I had everything I needed. Everything I needed? I interrupted him, something I'd never done before. David, I've asked for grocery money 3 times this month, and each time you've told me to wait. Because you're buying unnecessary items, he snapped back. Do you really need name-brand cereal when the generic stuff is just as good? Do you really need fresh flowers for your apartment when that money could be better invested? Fresh flowers. I had asked for $10 to buy fresh flowers, something that had always brought me joy, and he had refused because the money could be better invested. Presumably invested in whatever online gambling platform he was using to chase his losses with my life savings. That night, I did something I'd never done before in 6 months of this arrangement. I went through my apartment systematically, looking for any money David didn't know about. I found $43 in various hiding places, old purses, jacket pockets, the back of my silverware drawer. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I walked to the bodega on the corner and bought flowers. Bright yellow sunflowers that reminded me of the summers when David was young, when we'd drive upstate to pick fruit and he'd run through the fields with his arms spread wide, laughing with pure joy. Standing in my kitchen, arranging those sunflowers in an old mason jar, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of making a choice for myself, of doing something just because it made me happy. But when David came by 2 days later and saw the flowers, his face darkened with suspicion. Where did you get money for flowers? I could have lied. I could have said a neighbor gave them to me, or that I'd found them somewhere. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said, I used my own money. What money? Mom, all your money is being managed responsibly. If you had access to cash that I didn't know about, that creates problems with the budget I've carefully planned. The budget he'd carefully planned. As if my desire for flowers was a disruption to some grand financial scheme rather than the natural wish of an elderly woman to bring a little beauty into her life. It was $43, David. My own money that I'd saved in small amounts over the years. He held out his hand. I need you to give me any other money you might have hidden away. I can't manage your finances effectively if you're making unauthorized purchases. Unauthorized purchases. With my own money. I stared at his outstretched hand, this man who had once been my baby, my little boy, my greatest pride and joy. And I said the word that would change everything, no. His expression shifted so quickly it was like watching a mask fall away. The pretense of concern, of protection, of loving care, all of it vanished in an instant, replaced by cold fury. What did you say? I said no, David. I'm not giving you any more of my money. I want you to return control of my finances to me immediately. He stepped closer, and for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own son. Not just emotionally afraid, but physically afraid. He was bigger than me, younger, stronger, and the look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before. You're not thinking clearly, Mom. You're having some kind of breakdown. Maybe we need to talk about getting you some help, some professional care. Professional care. He was threatening to have me declared incompetent, to have me committed somewhere he could control me completely. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I made a mistake giving you control of my money, and now I'm correcting that mistake. That's when he laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. You think you can just change your mind? It doesn't work that way, Mom. Those papers you signed are legal documents. I have power of attorney, which means I have the authority to make decisions about what's best for you. Then I'll get a lawyer and have those documents revoked. With what money? He asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. You don't have access to any money, remember? And no lawyer is going to take on a case like this without a retainer, especially when it's clear that you're suffering from some kind of cognitive decline. Cognitive decline. He was building a narrative, creating a story that would justify keeping me under his control indefinitely. I could see the whole plan now, the trap I'd walked into with my eyes wide open because I'd believed that being a mother meant sacrificing everything, trusting completely, never saying no to your child no matter how unreasonable their demands became. I want you to leave now, I said quietly. I don't think that's a good idea. You're clearly agitated, not thinking rationally. Maybe I should stay here tonight, make sure you don't do anything to hurt yourself. Get out of my apartment, David. He shook his head sadly, as if I was a confused child having a tantrum. I can't do that, Mom. I have a responsibility to protect you, even from yourself. That's when I understood that this wasn't just financial abuse anymore. David was preparing to imprison me in my own home, to cut me off from the outside world completely while he systematically drained every account, sold every stock, liquidated every asset I'd spent a lifetime accumulating. I walked to my front door and opened it. Get out, or I'm calling the police. And tell them what? That your loving son is trying to take care of you? That you gave me legal authority to manage your affairs and now you're having second thoughts. He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. I have recordings of our conversations, Mom. Hours of you sounding confused, anxious, unable to make rational decisions about money. Any police officer, any judge, any social worker who hears those recordings will agree that you need protection from your own poor judgment. Recordings. He had been recording our phone calls, documenting every moment of confusion or uncertainty, building a case that I was mentally incompetent. I thought about all the times I'd called him frustrated or upset, not understanding why I couldn't access my own money, sounding exactly like the confused elderly woman he was pretending I was. He walked over to the door and closed it, turning the locks with deliberate care. Here's what's going to happen, Mom. You're going to go to your bedroom and think about what you really want. Do you want to keep fighting this and force me to take more drastic measures to protect you? Or do you want to accept that people who love you are trying to help you live safely and comfortably? More drastic measures. I didn't want to think about what that might mean, but I was starting to understand that I'd seriously underestimated my son's willingness to go to extremes to keep control of my money. I went to my bedroom that night, but not because David had ordered me to. I went because I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out how I'd gotten into this nightmare and how I might possibly get out. The 6th month was when everything changed completely. I woke up one morning to find that David had moved into my apartment. Not officially, not with any discussion or permission, but his clothes were hanging in my closet, his toiletries were in my bathroom, and he was sleeping on my sofa every night. When I asked him what he was doing there, he explained patiently that he was concerned about my mental state and thought I needed closer supervision. Closer supervision. I was a prisoner in my own home, watched constantly by the person who had systematically stolen my independence, my dignity, and my financial security. The first week of David's constant presence was like being slowly suffocated. He monitored every phone call, every visitor, every moment of my day. When my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked to check on me, something she'd been doing weekly for years, David answered the door and told her that I was resting and couldn't have visitors. When I tried to go for a walk around the block, something I'd done every day for years to manage my arthritis, David insisted on coming with me. He walked half a step behind me, like a guard escorting a prisoner, making conversation with the neighbors we met that subtly established his authority over my life. Mom's been having some memory issues lately, he'd say with false concern. I'm staying with her for a while to make sure she's safe. Memory issues. He was spreading the story of my mental incompetence throughout the neighborhood, ensuring that if I tried to seek help, people would assume I was confused, unreliable, possibly suffering from dementia. But the worst part wasn't the constant surveillance or even the financial abuse that continued relentlessly in the background. The worst part was watching David systematically erase my identity, my history, my right to exist as an independent human being. He went through my apartment like he was preparing it for an estate sale, deciding which of my possessions had value and which were clutter that needed to be discarded. The photo albums I'd treasured for decades were taking up unnecessary space. The books I'd collected over a lifetime of reading were dusty and outdated. Even my clothing was subject to his review, with entire wardrobes disappearing because they were inappropriate for someone your age. One morning, I woke up to find that my landline phone had been disconnected, not just the service, but the actual phone itself had been removed from my apartment. When I asked David about it, he explained that the phone was redundant since I had a cell phone, and the monthly service fee was an unnecessary expense. But I knew the real reason. The landline was the one phone he couldn't monitor completely, the one connection to the outside world that didn't go through devices he controlled. By removing it, he'd eliminated my last potential lifeline to independence. That afternoon, while David was out, I tried to use my cell phone to call my old supervisor from the hospital, someone I'd worked with for 20 years and trusted completely. But when I dialed her number, I got a recording saying the call couldn't be completed. I tried several other numbers, old friends, former colleagues, even my doctor's office, and got the same result. It took me a while to realize what had happened. David hadn't just taken control of my finances, he'd somehow restricted my phone service so that I could only make calls to numbers he'd approved. I could call 911 in an emergency, but I couldn't reach anyone who might help me understand what was happening or offer assistance in getting my life back. That night, I lay in my bed listening to David moving around my living room, rearranging furniture, making phone calls in hushed tones that I couldn't quite hear through the thin walls. I felt like I was disappearing, becoming a ghost in my own life while someone else took over my identity, my resources, my future. But then I remembered something my mother used to tell me when I was young and facing problems that seemed insurmountable. Every prison has a weakness, Margaret. Even the strongest walls have cracks. You just have to be patient enough to find them. I started paying closer attention to David's routines, his habits, his moments of carelessness. I noticed that he left his laptop open sometimes when he went to the bathroom, and I caught glimpses of the screens he was working on. Bank statements showing my accounts being systematically drained. Investment portfolios being liquidated. Even the small amount of Bitcoin I owned was being converted to cash and funneled into what looked like online gambling sites. My life savings, the security I'd built over 40 years of hard work, was literally being gambled away while I sat trapped in my own apartment, helpless to stop it. But I also noticed something else. David was getting sloppy, overconfident. He was so sure that I was beaten, so convinced that I'd accepted my fate as a helpless old woman who needed his protection, that he was starting to let his guard down in small ways. One morning, he left his phone charging on my kitchen counter while he took a shower. I had maybe 10 minutes while the sound of running water covered any noise I might make. With shaking hands, I scrolled through his recent calls and found numbers I didn't recognize, numbers with long conversations that suggested ongoing relationships. I memorized one of the numbers, a woman named Sarah who David had talked to for over an hour just the night before. Was this his girlfriend? His accomplice? Someone who might help me understand what was really happening? But my 10 minutes were up, and I heard the shower turning off. I put the phone back exactly where David had left it and retreated to my bedroom, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of small rebellion. That became my routine over the following days. Gathering tiny pieces of information whenever David's attention was elsewhere. Learning the passwords he used by watching his fingers on keyboards. Memorizing phone numbers and account information that might be useful later. I felt like a spy in my own life, but it was the first time in months that I'd felt any sense of agency, any possibility that I might not be completely powerless. 2 weeks into David's complete takeover of my apartment, something happened that changed everything. I woke up one morning feeling dizzy and nauseous, with chest pains that I recognized from my nursing days as potentially serious. I'd had a mild heart attack 6 years earlier, and these symptoms felt similar, not immediately life-threatening, but definitely requiring medical attention. When I told David I needed to go to the emergency room, he looked annoyed rather than concerned. "Are you sure it's not just anxiety, Mom? You've been under a lot of stress lately, and sometimes that can manifest as physical symptoms." Physical symptoms. He was dismissing what could be a cardiac event as psychosomatic anxiety, and I realized with cold clarity that David no longer saw me as a human being whose health and safety mattered. I was just an inconvenience now, an obstacle between him and complete control of my assets. "David, I was a nurse for 40 years. I know the difference between anxiety and heart problems. I need medical attention now." He sighed heavily, as if I was being deliberately difficult. "Fine. But I'm coming with you, and I'm going to explain to the doctors that you've been having some cognitive issues lately. They need to understand your mental state when they're evaluating your complaints." Cognitive issues. He was planning to undermine my credibility with the medical staff, to ensure that any health problems I reported would be dismissed as confusion or attention-seeking behavior. But as we sat in the taxi on the way to the hospital, I made a decision that probably saved my life in more ways than one. I was going to tell the doctors everything. Not just about my chest pains, but about the financial abuse, the imprisonment, the systematic destruction of my independence. I was going to risk David's anger, risk being labeled as mentally unstable, risk whatever consequences might come from speaking the truth. Because the alternative, continuing to live as a prisoner in my own life while my son stole everything I'd worked for, was no longer acceptable. At the emergency room, the triage nurse took my vitals and asked about my symptoms in the calm, professional manner I remembered from my own nursing days. David hovered beside me, interrupting frequently to add commentary about my recent confusion and tendency to exaggerate minor problems. But when the nurse asked David to step outside so she could conduct a private patient assessment, something shifted in the room. For the first time in months, I was alone with a healthcare professional who couldn't be manipulated or controlled by my son. "Mrs. Thompson," the nurse said gently, "besides the chest pain, is there anything else you'd like to tell me about your current situation?" I looked at her kind face, saw the genuine concern in her eyes, and felt something break open inside my chest. Not my heart, but the dam I'd built around my fear and shame and desperate need to maintain the pretense that everything was fine. "My son has taken control of my entire life," I whispered. "He has all my money, he's living in my apartment without permission, and I can't leave or call anyone or make any decisions about my own existence. I think he's planning to have me declared incompetent so he can keep my assets permanently." The nurse didn't look shocked or skeptical. She nodded calmly and made notes in her chart. "How long has this been going on?" 6 months. It started when he said he needed help with gambling debts, and I gave him temporary power of attorney. But now he won't give it back, and he's systematically stealing everything I've saved for my retirement. "Are you in immediate physical danger?" I thought about David's increasingly aggressive behavior, his willingness to lock doors and restrict my movements, the cold calculation in his eyes when he looked at me now. "I don't know. Maybe. He's desperate to keep control of my money, and I'm starting to think there's nothing he wouldn't do to prevent me from getting help. The nurse stood up. I'm going to have the social worker come talk to you, and I want the doctor to be aware of your full situation when he evaluates your medical needs. Is that okay? It was more than okay. It was the first ray of hope I'd felt in months. Over the next 4 hours, while David paced impatiently in the waiting room, I told my story to a parade of hospital staff who listened with professional compassion and took detailed notes. The social worker explained my legal options for revoking power of attorney. The doctor confirmed that my chest pains were likely stress-related but recommended ongoing cardiac monitoring given my history. Most importantly, they all treated me like a rational adult whose concerns were valid and whose rights deserved protection. When David was finally allowed back into my treatment room, his demeanor was agitated and suspicious. He could sense that something had changed, that his careful narrative about my mental instability was being challenged by professionals who saw me as credible and coherent. "What did you tell them?" he asked in a low voice while the doctor was out of the room. I told them the truth. His face flushed with anger, but he couldn't explode in front of the medical staff. Instead, he put on his most concerned son voice and began explaining to anyone who would listen that I'd been confused and paranoid lately, making wild accusations against family members who were only trying to help. But it was too late. The hospital staff had already formed their own impressions, and David's obvious attempts at manipulation only reinforced their concerns about my situation. When we left the hospital that evening, David was quiet and tense. I could practically hear him recalculating, trying to figure out how to regain control of a narrative that was starting to slip away from him. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to him make phone calls in the living room, I heard fragments of conversations that chilled me. He was talking about accelerating the timeline and moving assets more quickly and minimizing risks from outside interference. I realized that my trip to the hospital had accomplished something important but also dangerous. I'd established a record of the abuse, connected with professionals who could help me, but I'd also forced David to recognize that his control was threatened. And cornered animals, I knew from my nursing experience, were often the most dangerous. The next morning, I woke up to find a locksmith changing the locks on my front door. When I asked David what was happening, he explained calmly that he was upgrading security because my episode at the hospital had convinced him that I might pose a danger to myself if I tried to leave the apartment alone. "This is for your own protection, Mom. Until we can get you properly evaluated by a psychiatrist and establish a care plan that keeps you safe, it's better if you stay inside where I can supervise you." Upgrading security. He was installing locks that could only be opened from the outside, turning my apartment into a literal prison cell. And his mention of psychiatric evaluation made it clear that he was moving ahead with his plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. I stood in my living room, watching a stranger install locks that would trap me in my own home, and felt something crystallize inside me. Not resignation, but a cold, clear determination that I'd never experienced before. David had underestimated me completely. He saw an elderly woman who had been conditioned by a lifetime of putting others first to accept whatever treatment her family chose to give her. He saw someone who was too isolated, too ashamed, too afraid of being alone to fight back effectively. What he didn't see was a woman who had spent 4 decades in high-stress medical situations, making life-and-death decisions under pressure, dealing with emergencies that required quick thinking and decisive action. He didn't see someone who had survived divorce, single parenthood, financial hardship, and every other challenge life had thrown at her. Most importantly, he didn't see that his own actions were transforming me from a loving, compliant mother into someone who was finally ready to prioritize her own survival over his comfort. That afternoon, while David was out meeting with what he called his financial advisor, but which I suspected was either his gambling connection or possibly a lawyer helping him cement his control over my assets, I put my plan into action. First, I called the hospital social worker from my cell phone, using one of the few numbers David hadn't blocked. I explained that my situation had escalated and that I was now being physically confined against my will. Then I did something that required all the courage I'd ever possessed. I called 911. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 73 years old, and I'm being held prisoner in my own apartment by my son, who has stolen my money and is now preventing me from leaving. I need police assistance. The dispatcher was professional and efficient, asking for details about my location and the nature of the threat. When I explained that the locks had been changed so I couldn't leave, she assured me that officers were being dispatched immediately. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on my door, not the casual knock of a neighbor or delivery person, but the authoritative knock of law enforcement. I heard David's key in the lock, heard him talking to the officers in the hallway, his voice taking on that concerned, reasonable tone he used so effectively. But when the police entered my apartment, they weren't interested in David's explanations. They were focused on me, on my account of what had been happening, on the evidence of my confinement. "Ma'am, did you give your son permission to change these locks?" one officer asked. "No, I did not. This is my apartment. I pay the rent. He moved in without my permission 6 months ago and has been controlling every aspect of my life since then." The officer examined the new locks, noted that they could only be opened from the outside, and exchanged meaningful looks with his partner. "Sir," he said to David, "we need to see the documentation that gives you legal authority to restrict your mother's movement." David produced the power of attorney papers, but the officers pointed out that financial power of attorney didn't grant him the right to physically confine me or control where I could go. They explained that what he was doing constituted false imprisonment, regardless of his stated intentions. "But she's not mentally competent to make decisions about her own safety," David protested. "She needs protection from herself." "Has she been declared mentally incompetent by a court?" the second officer asked. "Well, no, but then she has the right to come and go as she pleases, regardless of your concerns about her judgment." What happened next was like watching a house of cards collapse. The officers required David to restore my ability to leave my apartment freely. They took a detailed report about the financial abuse and referred the case to the district attorney's office for investigation. Most importantly, they connected me with legal aid services that could help me revoke the power of attorney and regain control of my finances. By the time the police left, David's carefully constructed prison had been dismantled, at least temporarily. But I could see in his eyes that this wasn't over. He was furious, cornered, and still in control of every penny I owned. Whatever came next was going to be a battle for my very survival. That night, David didn't sleep on my sofa. He left the apartment entirely, but not before delivering a speech that revealed just how far he'd fallen from the little boy I'd raised with such love and hope. "You've made a serious mistake, Mom. You've turned this into a legal matter instead of keeping it in the family where it belongs. Now there are going to be consequences that I can't protect you from. When you're living in some state facility because you can't afford private care anymore, remember that this is the choice you made." State facility. He was threatening to leave me destitute, to steal everything I owned and then abandon me to whatever minimal care society provides for elderly people with no resources. After 40 years of working to ensure that would never happen to me, my own son was planning to make it my reality. But as I listened to his threats, I realized something important. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid. I was angry, yes, and sad about what our relationship had become. But I wasn't afraid anymore, because the worst thing I'd been afraid of, being completely alone, had already happened. David had been treating me as if I was already dead to him, already nothing more than a source of income to be exploited until it ran dry. The truth was, I'd been completely alone for months while living in the same space as my son. At least now I was alone by choice, with the possibility of building something genuine rather than surviving something toxic. The legal battle that followed was everything David had threatened it would be: expensive, emotionally draining, and complicated by the fact that he'd been systematically documenting evidence of what he claimed was my mental decline. His lawyers argued that I'd given him power of attorney during a moment of clarity, but that my current desire to revoke it proved I was no longer competent to make such decisions. But I had advantages David hadn't anticipated. The hospital records from my emergency room visit established that multiple healthcare professionals had found me coherent and rational. The police report documented his illegal confinement of me and his attempts to manipulate the narrative. Most importantly, the financial records told a story that no amount of legal maneuvering could hide. My life savings hadn't been invested wisely or used to pay legitimate debts. The money had been gambled away on sports betting sites and online casinos, with occasional large expenditures that looked suspiciously like attempts to pay off gambling debts that kept growing faster than they could be resolved. In 6 months, David had lost almost $60,000 of my money. Not invested it poorly, not used it for necessary expenses, but literally gambled it away while keeping me imprisoned in my own home to prevent me from discovering what he was doing. The legal aid attorney who represented me was a young woman named Jessica who reminded me of myself at 30, smart, determined, and absolutely uninterested in accepting "that's just how family relationships work" as an excuse for abuse. "Mrs. Thompson," she told me during our first meeting, "what your son did to you isn't just morally wrong. It's financially elder abuse, and it's illegal. We're not just going to get your power of attorney revoked. We're going to pursue criminal charges and civil recovery of your stolen assets." Criminal charges. For months I'd been thinking of my situation as a family problem, a personal failure, a private tragedy that I needed to endure or resolve quietly. Jessica helped me understand that it was actually a serious crime, one that happened to thousands of elderly Americans every year, and one that the legal system was equipped to address. The court hearing to revoke the power of attorney was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October. I woke up that day feeling nervous but determined, wearing the blue dress I'd bought for David's college graduation and a pair of earrings my mother had given me when I became a nurse. I wanted to look like the competent, independent woman I'd been before this nightmare began. David arrived at the courthouse with 2 lawyers and a briefcase full of documents designed to prove that I was mentally unstable and needed his continued protection. He'd even brought character witnesses, friends of his who were prepared to testify that they'd been concerned about my behavior in recent months. But when the judge reviewed the evidence, the pattern was clear. Every example of my supposed incompetence dated from the period when David had been controlling my finances and restricting my independence. Every moment of confusion or distress had been a rational response to being systematically abused and gaslit by someone I'd trusted completely. Your Honor, Jessica argued, Mrs. Thompson wasn't displaying signs of dementia or mental incompetence. She was displaying signs of being the victim of financial abuse and false imprisonment. Any confusion or anxiety she demonstrated was the natural result of discovering that her son was stealing her life savings while keeping her trapped in her own home. The medical evaluation ordered by the court confirmed Jessica's argument. I was mentally competent, physically capable of living independently, and emotionally stable despite the trauma I'd endured. The power of attorney was revoked immediately, and I regained legal control of what remained of my assets. What remained wasn't much. Of the $200,000 I'd saved over a lifetime of careful financial planning, less than $70,000 was left in recoverable form. The rest had been gambled away, spent on David's lifestyle, or transferred to accounts that would take years of litigation to access. But sitting in that courtroom, hearing the judge declare that I was competent and had been wronged, feeling the weight of legal documentation that restored my autonomy, I felt richer than I had in months. Not financially, but in terms of dignity, self-respect, and hope for the future. David didn't speak to me as we left the courthouse. His lawyers had already advised him that criminal charges were likely and that any contact with me could be construed as intimidation or harassment. As I watched him walk away down the courthouse steps, I felt something I hadn't expected, not anger or sadness, but a strange sense of completion. This man who had manipulated and stolen from me wasn't really my son anymore, if he ever had been. The little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been proud of, the person I'd thought I was helping, maybe that person had never existed, or maybe he'd been consumed entirely by addiction and greed and the kind of entitlement that turns family love into exploitation. Either way, my obligation to him was over. I'd given him life, raised him, educated him, supported him through every crisis and failure, and given him every opportunity to become a decent human being. What he'd chosen to do with those gifts was his responsibility, not mine. The criminal case against David took 8 months to resolve. During that time, I rebuilt my life from the ground up, learning hard lessons about trust and boundaries and the difference between loving someone and enabling them to destroy you. I moved out of my Upper West Side apartment, too many memories of imprisonment and betrayal, and found a smaller but brighter place in Brooklyn, near Prospect Park. The neighborhood was full of families and elderly couples walking their dogs, the kind of community where neighbors actually knew each other's names. I started volunteering at a senior center in my new neighborhood, using my nursing background to help other elderly people navigate health crises and medical bureaucracy. It felt good to be useful again, to remember that I had skills and experience that could benefit others. But the most important part of my healing was learning to live for myself again. For 73 years, I defined my worth almost entirely in terms of what I could do for other people, as a nurse, as a mother, as a caregiver and provider and source of unconditional support. David's abuse had taught me the devastating consequences of having no boundaries, no sense of self-worth independent of what I could give to others. I started small. I bought flowers for my apartment every week, not because they served any practical purpose, but because they made me happy. I signed up for a painting class at the local community college, something I'd wanted to do for decades but had never prioritized. I made friends with other women my age who were also learning to rebuild their lives after major losses, not all of them from abusive children, but all of them discovering that it wasn't too late to start over. The day David was sentenced to 2 years in prison for financial elder abuse, I wasn't in the courtroom. I was in Prospect Park with my new friend Eleanor, feeding ducks and talking about the trip to Ireland we were planning for the following spring. When Jessica called to tell me about the sentence, I felt a brief moment of satisfaction, but mostly I felt relieved that the legal chapter was finally closed. David never apologized. Not during the trial, not in the letters his lawyer sent proposing plea agreements, not even in the brief statement he gave to the judge before sentencing. To the end, he maintained that everything he'd done had been for my own good, that I was too old and confused to manage my own affairs, that I was being manipulated by lawyers and social workers who didn't understand our family dynamics. Maybe he actually believed that. Maybe the addiction and entitlement had progressed to the point where he genuinely couldn't see the difference between helping me and exploiting me. Or maybe he knew exactly what he'd done but couldn't afford the psychological cost of genuine remorse. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. My healing didn't depend on his acknowledgement or his change of heart. I'd spent too many years waiting for other people, David, his father, various friends and colleagues, to give me the respect and appreciation I thought I deserved. Now I was learning to give those things to myself. The civil recovery process was more successful than anyone had expected. Jessica and her team managed to trace most of the stolen money through bank records and gambling site transactions, and I eventually recovered about $30,000 more than we'd initially thought was possible. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to secure my basic financial stability for the rest of my life, especially combined with my Social Security benefits and the small pension from the hospital. More importantly, the process taught me to be actively involved in my own financial protection. I learned about investment monitoring, legal documentation, and the warning signs of financial abuse that I could share with other elderly people who might be vulnerable to similar exploitation. A year after David's sentencing, I was invited to speak at a conference about elder abuse prevention. Standing in front of 200 social workers, lawyers, and healthcare professionals, telling my story publicly for the first time, I felt something I'd never experienced before: pride in my own survival. Not pride in being a victim, but pride in being a survivor. Pride in refusing to accept that being old meant accepting abuse. Pride in choosing my own dignity over family loyalty when the two became incompatible. Pride in learning, at 74 years old, that I was capable of starting over, building new relationships, creating new sources of meaning and joy. The woman who had signed over control of her life 6 months into David's manipulation was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more determined to protect not just her own autonomy but the autonomy of other vulnerable people who might face similar threats. Sometimes people ask me if I miss having David in my life, if I regret the legal actions that resulted in his imprisonment. The honest answer is that I miss the person I thought he was, the son I believed I was helping, the relationship I thought we had. But I don't miss the reality of what our relationship had actually become: a toxic dynamic that was literally killing me, financially and emotionally and spiritually. I've learned to grieve for that fantasy relationship while celebrating the real life I've built in its absence. Every morning when I wake up in my sunny Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by paintings I've created and books I've chosen to read and flowers I've bought simply because they're beautiful, I remember what it feels like to live authentically, to make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's demands. My new life isn't perfect. I'm still dealing with the financial consequences of David's theft, still learning to trust my own judgment after months of being told I was incompetent, still sometimes lonely in ways that remind me why I was vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. But it's my life, lived on my terms, with boundaries I've chosen and relationships I've built based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. At 75 years old, I'm finally learning what it means to love myself enough to say no to people who don't respect me, even when those people share my blood. The most unexpected gift of this whole ordeal has been discovering that I'm not alone. Since becoming involved in elder abuse advocacy, I've met dozens of women and men who've had similar experiences: children, spouses, relatives, and caregivers who've used their positions of trust to exploit the people who love them most. We're all different ages, from different backgrounds, with different stories of how we ended up trapped by people we'd trusted completely. But we share something important: the hard-earned wisdom that comes from choosing self-respect over false peace, from learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is family. Last month, I got a letter from David. He's been released from prison and is living in a halfway house in Queens, working at a restaurant and supposedly attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. The letter was full of apologies and promises, explanations about his addiction and requests for a chance to rebuild our relationship. I read it twice, then put it in a drawer with all the other letters he'd sent over the past 2 years. I may respond someday, but not until I'm sure that any contact would be based on my choice rather than his need, my boundaries rather than his promises. For now, I'm focused on the life I've built for myself. Next month, Eleanor and I are leaving for our trip to Ireland, something I never could have afforded or enjoyed during the years when David was draining my accounts and my spirit. We're going to see castles and cliffs and tiny villages where people have been living independently for centuries, regardless of their age or family circumstances. I'm 75 years old, and I'm just beginning to understand who I am when I'm not defined by what I can do for other people. It turns out I'm someone who enjoys painting landscapes, reading mystery novels, and having long conversations with new friends who appreciate my company without expecting me to solve their problems or fund their lifestyles. I'm someone who can live alone without being lonely, who can love people without losing myself, who can be generous without being exploited. I'm someone who learned, almost too late but not quite, to recognize the difference between helping someone and enabling their abuse of me. Most importantly, I'm someone who survived. Not just David's financial abuse and imprisonment, but the deeper prison of believing that my worth was measured entirely by my willingness to sacrifice everything for people who saw that sacrifice as their right rather than my gift. If you're listening to this story and it sounds familiar, if you recognize yourself in the woman who gave up her autonomy because she couldn't bear to say no to someone she loved, or if you know someone who's being isolated and exploited by family members who claim to have their best interests at heart, please know that it's never too late to choose yourself. It doesn't matter how old you are, how long the abuse has been going on, or how complicated your family relationships have become. You deserve to live with dignity, to make your own choices about your money and your living situation and your daily activities. You deserve to have relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. And you deserve to discover, as I did, that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's the foundation of genuine love, the only way to build relationships that nurture rather than destroy the people in them. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family love felt more like a prison than a blessing? Have you watched someone you care about disappear into the demands of relatives who took more than they gave? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories matter, your survival matters, and your choice to prioritize your own well-being matters more than you might realize. If this story helped you see your own situation more clearly, please like this video and subscribe to help it reach other people who might need to hear that they're not alone, that it's not too late, and that choosing themselves isn't betrayal, it's liberation. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about the stories of people like me who learned, sometimes the hard way, that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. And thank you for believing that every person, regardless of age, deserves to live free.